This is going to be an interesting session focusing on tools and processes, so the more practical side of the work of an architect. I would like to thank you all for making time to attend, and then I would like to introduce the 4 speakers. So we have quite a varied set of speakers on the various topics related to tools and processes. Alain Perez, CTO at AXA Belgium, and we'll be talking about structuring and managing the collaborative work of an architect. We will have Laurent Cornet, XPLUS consultant, focusing on enterprise architecture, focusing in this session on the architectural backlog. Then I myself will also talk about the various tools which can be used in the context of collaborative content creation. And then last but not least, we have our colleague Peter Dubois, who will talk about how to make an inventory of relevant facts. So that is mostly about the structured content management behind it. Before we dive into the content, I would like to walk you through a few practical aspects. Since we are with so many people, it is useful that we interact, but that we interact via chat. So there I would like to ask you to use the chat functionality of Teams to ask your question or to mention your remark. It is best that we all stay muted during the webinar, which is going perfect so far. So thanks already for that. We will launch a few questions, a few polls during the session, by which we want to also see how things are going in your organization. So each speaker will provide a question via the poll functionality in the chat, and you can just respond to that. Some people might not have the ability to vote, potentially due to technical issues. So in that case, you can just reply in the chat with the answer which is most appropriate in your circumstances. Like always, you can ask also additional questions after the event, which might be also personally addressed to the speakers. There's a common email box for that. It's info@xplus.eu. So after the session as well, we can continue to interact. And on the questions which you will mention during the session, we will not interrupt the speakers immediately, but rather we will consolidate the questions, and we will try to find time at the end to come back to those questions during question and answers. So please just write them down. We will come to that later on. Don't worry about that. And then mostly evidently enjoy the session. This is created for you. So I sincerely hope that you get something out of it at the end of this week. Right, and then I would like to give the word to Alain Perez for the first section. Alain is CTO, and he will talk about the challenge of structuring and managing the inherently collaborative nature of architectural work. So Alain, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Bart. Good morning to all. Good to see a lot of familiar names. Bart, you will do the slides. So first, before I start, this is a testimonial on how it works at AXA. This works well for us. For sure, there are many other ways to look at it, but also the way how we have constructed this throughout the years is often by listening to several of you, looking and hearing best practices, and then trying to find the best fit. Now, before I really jump into the content, next slide, Bart, please. Maybe a small word on architecture at AXA, so that you have at least some kind of context. We serve only in Belgium 3 million customers. We have about 400 applications, and I don't count the end user applications in here. 300 technologies. The delivery teams are organized in 48 product teams. and we serve 5 lines of business. Next slide, Bart. Now, collaboration is an essential point. I think when I looked at how we worked 5 years ago, it was much less collaborative, much more from a let's say a cost perspective. Well, this has completely disappeared, and we see this works very well. And it's very time consuming as well. Huh? So apart from all the content discussions, I think the collaboration is the key element of a success of an architectural department. And that goes in our context towards the group, being member of 57 other countries. A lot of communication with the business teams, with the security teams, while the security architects are within my perimeter. The data teams with the CDO, the engineering teams, delivery and procurement. Maybe just as one example, what we do with procurement, for instance, is that there is an agreement that procurement will not go into an RFI or an RFP or into a purchase without the approval of architecture, and vice versa. When we learn about a certain initiative, and sometimes we still have ghost requests, as you can imagine, then we will also first check with procurement whether they are informed or not. So and that happens in all those directions. So that happens at security level, data level, etc. Bart, next slide, please. Now, what we've learned as well is that the key element is that the essence of architecture is a dialogue between business and IT. It's not so much, and there as well, if I look at 5 years ago, we were more in the setup of providing build permits, and then there was a red color, an amber color, or a green color. We still have that, but it's becoming less important, let's say. In the sense that what we try to do in that dialogue is to have a discussion with all those stakeholders to explain what are the advantages and disadvantages of a solution or a direction, what are the consequences, and we document those consequences. And what we've noticed that in certain cases we let a direction go, even if we are not really in favor of it. But we've learned that often what we predicted came true, and then obviously you get more credibility into the organization without having to fight for it. So a very natural process. And you see the collaboration and the dialogue also in a lot of other elements, in the sense that we don't really do projects anymore. We work more in epics. We try to avoid of building applications. We try to build business services. That's not always the case yet. So it means that instead of building a Guidewire claim center application, we build services like first notification of loss, providing a quick quote, and those type of things that we often then reuse in another context. And we don't have software architectural documents anymore, which documents a project, but we are documenting products, and those products are then touched by the project. But that way we always have an accurate documentation of what is realized. Next slide, Bart. And then on the essence of what we are using from a process and a tool perspective, for me the key game changer was the moment when we implemented a change board. So the change board is basically the management committee together with the CTO and the CDO. So all transformation initiatives, all budgets, whether it's a business transformation and IT transformation, they all pass via a change board. And being there, being at the places where decisions are taken is really key. And that counts also for the complete architectural community within my team. They are all present in all steercos, in all decision governance, so that each time that dialogue can happen, not as a bad cop approach, but more as an advisory, giving advantages, disadvantages, and then moving forward. The second point where we have heavily invested, also thanks to the cloudification exercise, because we are basically leaving our own data centers, is that we blueprint the products. We use Archimate in this case, but it really helps to very quickly know what's happening, how it has been constructed, etc. We obviously still have the build permits, but again in agile mode, so it can be that an initiative comes to discuss every month. We still have compliance reports. So compliance reports are what we deliver the moment that the project goes into production. It's a bit like in the building construction. We check whether the construction has been done following the plan, yes, no, and what are the deviations. What's really also helping are the customer, broker, and employee journeys, and obviously, as any good architectural department or CTO department, you have your application and technology roadmaps. And then finally, Bart, if you can, we talk about processes and tools, but what is really essential is having the right people. AXA or IT at AXA Belgium is about 300 persons, of which 25 architects or lead engineers that steer the organization towards a better future. And as always, in every organization, we are always looking for talents as well. Voilà, that's it for my part. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you, Alain. Hi, my name is Laurent Cornet, and the question I'd like to provide elements of answer here is in 10 minutes or less, is how to get the architecture work organized, and the central concept being the architecture backlog. Next slide, please. So how does this work? It actually starts with identifying, capturing the concerns that need to be addressed by the architecture. That's the red rounded square that you see in the center of the slide. Architectural concerns, these are the important stuff, the directions that once you've taken them, they are difficult and costly to change because it's so structuring for whatever you're trying to achieve. So they come in various forms, and what this translates into is that as an architect, you are aligning people around decisions. The scope and breadth of those decisions will vary depending on where you are in the organization, but what changes is the impact of the decision. It still is a decision, but it's not the same impact if you are talking about a strategic study, for instance, that you need to understand how to solve a new business concern or answering an immediate delivery question for a team, for instance. So some of these concerns you will be able to immediately research a solution for, and that's the blue rounded square. Others you will have to put on the architecture backlog in order to be refined and prioritized. So this backlog is a prioritized list of concerns, and the concept is not new, which you need to groom regularly, of course, and from which you can pick up individual items, research potential solutions, so that a recommendation can be formulated and a decision taken. A decision that can potentially raise new concerns and new items to be put on the backlog, and that's why there is an arrow from the gray box to the red one. Now, logging the architectural decisions is perhaps one of the most important aspects. You do that, among others, to have a trace of the rationale, so you can come back to it 6 months later and explain those decisions. But looking at the architectural concerns, they can come from different angles, depending on where we are in the organization. And we're going to see that on the next slide, please. So on the right-hand side, you see a screenshot of the scaled agile framework. This is what you immediately see when you go to the site. And we see that there are different levels where an architect can have influence. The enterprise level, the solution level, the program level, the delivery team level, as far as you go down in the organization. If we look at those different kinds of architectural concerns on the left-hand side, you see that depending on their scope and breadth, they land in different parts of the backlog, or would be different backlogs. Typically, concerns in relation to what kind of project or initiative do I need to launch or stop will land at enterprise architecture level, while concerns such as what kind of integration pattern should I use between application A and B will land much closer to the delivery organization. Next slide, please. Now, if we look at the delivery side, so the delivery organization, there's of course a strong interlock between architectural decisions and the delivery backlog. We have different kinds of items in the delivery backlog. As you see, the business users will define the new features they want and identify defects. So these are the green and the red items. But the structuring items, the yellow ones, the intentional architecture, the architectural runway, name it as you like, and also the request to solve technical depth element, these are created as a result of the work of the architect. So all of that lands in the delivery backlog to be prioritized. So how do you prioritize? Well, you use your favorite method that often is Scrum, in which case you have a selection of items that you execute in a sprint to produce a program increment or a solution increment or product increment. The important part here is the architectural intake for new features that you see in the upper part of the slide on the left. It's important to have this intake because it's important to have an architect evaluate new feature requests, because there could be an architectural impact. There could be a missing structural items required for this new feature, or you may have to refactor a part of the solution, in which case you will need to realize that before the set feature can be implemented. Now, if this intake does not happen, or if the concern is not captured, you will notice that there is the idea to have a regular touch point also with the architects within the delivery of a sprint. That's on the right-hand side. But if a missing enabler, a missing structural item is identified at that point in time, it will need to be realized first, meaning that the feature for which we missed the intake, the feature that is already scheduled in the sprint, well, that feature will have to be put back on the backlog, and this is probably going to cause delays. So to avoid. Next slide, please. Now, how does that work in practice at the organizational level? Because architects also need to have some form of coordination and synchronization with other teams. How you are going to organize the architectural backlog depends on a number of factors. But if you want to have a strong interlock with delivery, like at AXA, we probably need to have some form of a common backlog. And this is where it's a good idea to be supported by an agile planning tool. Rally is such a tool, the screenshots that you see. It's an example, there are others. And the idea here is to have one backlog for everyone at the company levels with different views, of course, according to your specific concerns. Actually, should be a question about that, but I don't think it will be. Now, what does it mean for the architects, for the architectural decisions making? There are 4 big options to organize the architect and the decisions around it. The first option is that you can have the architects completely decentralized as a whole in the different teams, so push that at the lowest level of the organization and let the architectural decision emerge, perhaps even with no particular individual assigned to this role in the team, and let the teams take and log their own decisions. Another option is that different parts of a given concern, of a given decision, can be addressed by specialized architects, specialized profiles. One being more focused on performance, for instance, or perhaps on integration. So you start to identify individuals who will carry the burden of taking the decision. The next step is that you can have dedicated people with the role of architects who take accountability of the decisions, but the responsibility is spread on the teams. So it's more of a collaborative work between someone, so architect and the team, meaning that the architectural decisions are going to be a combination of input from this architect and the suggestion from the team. And finally, you can have what I would call the classical architect, who takes and the accountability and the responsibility of making the architectural decision with limited information input from the team. So how do you choose? Well, first of all, you can have several of those options in the same organization at different places. It's not black and white, it depends on where you are. Maybe you're in a transition period, but usually it also depends on what kind of business you're in. So what happens if you get one of those decisions wrong? does anybody die, or does a plane crash, or is there a 10 billion loss? So if the impact of having a wrong decision is catastrophic, you may want to go for perhaps for the classical model, so where there is an architect that takes all the decisions, or at least have dedicated people for architecture. It's also going to depend on your architectural side, but also on your organizational trajectory so far. What can you adopt? For instance, if you have always been in a very strong hierarchical system with a central team of architects focused on traditional control, that's going to strongly influence your current culture and by extension, your current ability to adopt one option or the other. It would probably be difficult to go to a fully decentralized model, for instance. Voilà. So this was what I wanted to cover. Looking at the time, we are indeed under the 10 minutes. So thank you for your attention, and I now give the word to Bart.
Thanks a lot, Laurent. We definitely have seen quite some questions popping up, so that's promising for the Q&A session at the end. So keep on asking questions. We will also try to reply in chat to the extent possible. In this section, I'd like to walk you through the approach and the tools which can be used to focus on the collaborative aspect of content creation for architects. Architects, they need to find the correct balance on how to prioritize their work and what to spend their time on. And there is a famous article by Philip Cruchten on what do software architects really do, but that generalizes towards all kinds of architects. And that calls for a balance between an internal focus and an external focus. The article is available freely online, so please do have a look. With regard to the external focus, there evidently it concerns interacting with others, and there typically this concerns getting input, seeing what the major concerns are, what the major constraints are, and how to get these addressed in your architectural work. Evidently also creating output, so preparing and providing communications, so aligning with people to see whether those concerns are addressed in the proposals which you make. Internally, evidently, it's a lot about consolidating all of the input which you have received, about preparing various scenarios, and about preparing that output. And now the perfect balance there is to find a 50-50 between the internal and the external focus. So that is something where also a lot of anti-patterns can be differentiated when an imbalance occurs. Now, when done well, content creation, it is merely one of the forms of knowledge sharing. And the thing about architectural content creation is that when you only focus on the individual initiative in which you are working, then it's quite labor intensive, and then you will do a lot of effort which is only productive within the particular time-bound setting of that project. That's not very efficient, so that's why it's more interesting to leverage that architectural effort beyond the initiative in which that content was required. And then you will rather focus on creating things like reference architecture, like decision trees, in order to address the same kind of questions which pop up across multiple projects, ideally merely once, or at least in a more productive manner. And so this knowledge sharing, which is done beyond the level of an individual initiative, that is something on which you as an architecture lead can have control. You can foster that knowledge sharing. And one of the key aspects about that is that you can foster it by increasing the appetite for, let's say, community collaboration. And one of the essential parts there is that it has a lot to do with establishing psychological safety, in the sense that if people are hesitant to step forward with stuff which goes beyond what is demanded within the particular project, essentially, they need to feel respected, and they need to feel that those kind of contributions are welcome, because typically within the architecture community there is quite an analytical approach. We are quite critical people, so there we need to ensure that there is room for brainstorming, that there is room for drafts, and that in a very incremental manner we can extend such work which goes beyond the level of a single initiative. So that also calls for some incentivation, where the incentivization is not so much focusing on typical financial rewards, because that has been proven to work actually against it. If you start to pay people to create content, you get all kinds of bad effects, but rather it is about social esteem. There is the social network within the company, and people really do respect the fact that their contributions are valued. So there you can foster knowledge sharing by working also on the social esteem aspects. When it comes then to collaboration, you can ask yourself, okay, which tools are typically in place to support that collaboration? And there we highlight a few different aspects of content creation, where most basically within a single initiative, you will typically focus on co-creation. So together with all the other roles with which you are collaborating, you are typically working throughout workshops in meetings, and there you use workshop facilitation tools like digital whiteboards. For example, Miro is a very popular one, and evidently during the whole Corona pandemic, the whole online collaboration has been booming. So a lot has been created about this, and a lot of material and tools are available there. Other examples are purely Microsoft Whiteboard, as well as Lucid Spark, but essentially the list is endless with regard to alternatives for that. Another set of tools which you can use for workshop facilitation is lean modeling tools. So Peter Dubois will follow up afterwards with regard to more structural modeling aspects. But typically, when you want to share a mental image of something during a collaboration, you need something light, and you need something which other people can address as well. So there, typically tools like draw.io or like Lucid Chart can typically be used to put some rigor, but not too much, into initial schemas. Essentially the equivalent of just making some pen and paper drawings. Then another set of tools regarding co-creation concerns survey tools, or audience response tools, in the sense that when you give a presentation, ideally you collect also some feedback. Our intention here was to use the Teams poll functionality. Sadly, we have been experiencing some issues with that, so that's why we now launch the questions in the chat. But other tools like Mentimeter or like Kahoot are often in use to immediately be able to share those responses, to not come up with the answers up front, but rather during the workshop create the answers together. So that on co-creation. Then on governed content management, well, that concerns both publishing and consuming documents under architectural governance. So typically there is a kind of workflow which establishes a certain validation status, in the sense that your content will typically first be proposed, but then will get some degree of confidence by being reviewed through other people. And such a workflow and such a governance of content is evidently important when it comes to guidelines, standards, training material, and as well as examples, because we can best inspire people by providing the golden standards, the examples themselves, which are illustrative, and they as well need to be approved, which needs to be reflected in the content management. Typical tools you see there are content management systems like SharePoint, Alfresco, but you also still often see just plain file drives being used. So just differentiating metadata by using creative folder titles. A third aspect then concerns elaborating topics. So topics which are rather still purely in the creative mode. So collaboratively authoring content. You see that also typically done by centers of excellence. Like, for example, when it concerns integration, then typically there is a central team addressing integration patterns, addressing how to use technology, and they're often, since the tempo of content creation is so fast and it's done in group, there often wiki-style tools are being used, like, for example, Confluence, Notion, or it could even simply be OneNote on a SharePoint to centralize those discussions. And then finally, a large part in content creation is also getting inspired by what can be found as commodity knowledge beyond the organization. And that typically calls out for pulling in innovation and change from external references. And there I'd like to make the reference to Jeff Stas's story on the red monkey. The red monkey sitting at the edge of the forest. And a good way to stimulate innovation is to ensure that there are people who are bringing new content in. Those can typically be the more recent hires, the people who still come with a backpack full of new ideas. But it can also be by people who are continuously looking out, reading articles, following professional journals or magazines on that, online content. There you can use online tools like social bookmarking tools. For example, Digo is a very good tool for that. Hypothesis.is is an open source tool for that, where in a community you can share these references in the sense that you don't have to invent a solution yourself. You can just refer to where it has been properly described. Typically, also you can refer to books, and there are popular. There's a popular tool to share reviews and annotations on books, which is, for example, Goodreads. So that's also a useful way of pulling in new content. Right. So that regarding tools, and then hooking into the topic which Alain already introduced. So how is what is the result of that collaboration, and how is the result of that collaboration structured? And there you typically see two different approaches. So historically, architectural content was mainly created within the context of a particular change initiative, which means that there, within the scope of a project, there is a deliverable, which is typically called a solution architecture document, sometimes also called software architecture document. But evidently it documents a lot more than merely applications. It documents the whole solution in all of its aspects. And there you typically see that the project touches upon various aspects of the business. So here represented as capabilities, where throughout your project portfolio, you will have all kinds of changes. And the issue there is that there is quite a fragmentation of the architectural footprint of, for example, a particular release throughout all of these projects. So when this is the way that architectural content is documented, well, then you have to somehow aggregate the impact on the architectural landscape of a certain release throughout all of these documents. Evidently, typically there will be some kind of cohesion, because it will be the same architects who will typically be assigned to the same kind of either components or processes or business functions or whatever. But document-wise, it is a fragmentation. Evidently, as you might expect, there is an alternative. That is that recently organizations have been focusing more on decomposing their landscapes. For example, their IT landscapes in products, but also more generally have taken up. So not only within the IT landscape, but also overall, we are trying to see how we can be more agile in the sense of being faster evolvable by being more autonomous within a particular environment. So we are changing our operating model to optimize autonomy. And this is typically done by product composition, so that we can also establish product teams around the assets which are involved there. And so it is a clustering, a grouping of people, but also of assets within these products. And in those organizations, the creation of architectural content is realigned to that product context, meaning, for example, that there you can have for a particular release, for example, by the end of the first quarter of this year, there can be a documentation about either a particular asset, or it could also just be at the level of a business process. There can be a description of what is the state of that process or that application at that particular release, at that particular moment in time. And that means that there is no longer a fragmentation, that rather you typically focus on getting a lot of output immediately in the form of what is called permanent documentation. So even when the project is long forgotten, the documentation still has value there, and you already prepare for that during the initiative itself. And evidently, that's the whole point, that you document the architectural footprint, so that it's very easy to see, okay, overall, across all of these individual initiatives, what will then be the impact on the landscape, be it at application, at business level, or even at infrastructure level. That's a bit the elaboration of those initiatives. And then I believe there is a question being launched also to reflect at your organization whether their architecture content is mainly initiative bound or product bound. That would be interesting to see your experience on that. And then I would like to provide the word to Peter. Peter, if you'd like.
Yes, thank you. So I will talk about tools and integration in the context of an architecture management framework. Of course, there's lots and lots of things to say, and I will have to limit myself to a number of selected subtopics. Next slide, please. So this is a general framework for architecture management that I created in the context of a mission around this. And what you see is that that you see three big domains. Can everybody stay on mute, please? Thank you. So what you see is that there are three main domains in which you can do architecture and which are in different organizations develop more or less depending on where their emphasis is. That's the strategic architecture part, which flows over in the domain the change architecture, which flows over into the run architecture. But there are feedback loops between these domains, obviously, because you do strategic architecture from an existing architecture. And of course, there's lots of inputs that you have in each of these domains, like for strategic architecture, there's business strategy and different investment teams, which are going to inform you. You're going to have information that you get from lifecycle management and cost management, and from business and IT, continuity and security, which comes typically in the different domains there. But you also want to have different types of architects facts in each of these domains. So they each have their own emphasis, like in strategy, it's more around capability mapping and about creating roadmaps, the temporal dimension. In change architecture, it's about your individual epic that you want to model out, the solution that you need to model out. And in the run architecture, it's about, okay, what is the landscape, the existing landscape? How are the data flows going in order to support also service management? But you're also fed from service management, and in the end, it's also going to inform things like the commissioning. So this is a good mental model to think about when you have to select a tool. So next slide, please. So when you select a tool, you need to think about, I mean, the reasons for selecting a tool, of course, these are considerations you have to make for each organization, and many organizations have tooling today already. But depending on which domain you want to emphasize, or if you want to have all the domains, you need to think about, okay, what capabilities do I need for each of these domains, and how is a tool supporting them, particular tools, because you will see that different tools have different levels of support for different types of capabilities within those domains. An important one, for example, in strategy is the time dimension. How can you support it best? And several tools are relatively limited there, and so there you're sort of replicating things and then changing it to reflect a different time dimension. Another one is how can current state architecture, which is in your run architecture domain, be used as a starting point for change. I mean, you don't just want to change these run objects, because then you pollute basically your run architecture. You need a way to replicate those, and how does a tool work with that? How can you report on what is created to your different stakeholders? We're going to put less emphasis there, but it's an important one. How can you publish it? How can you give access also to non-architecture stakeholders? A very important one is like, okay, can I exploit existing data in my enterprise and import it into my tool, and then assign it to the right objects. And what is then the semantics that I need to put around it, and which attributes can I adapt the existing attributes, and so on and so on. You can go in the end all the way down to how do you support, can a tool support this architectural validation process? Can we collaborate with each other, and so on and so on. And especially important is how do we structure everything inside the tool for our organizations. So can we go to the next slide? So what we did last year is we looked at a number of tools. Some of them are literally top right quadrants, the evolving leaders, as we call them. They exist already 20 years. This was Abacus and BizDesign. What you see there, they're very, I mean, they're still like client server based, but they have also a cloud component, and then they bolted on a lot of reporting capabilities, and BizDesign even process management capabilities. And then on the other hand, you have what we call, and on the other side of the spectrum, we have Archi, that a lot of you maybe will know, which is the open source Archimate tool, which is just a client, but is also getting plugins now to get some type of collaboration or repository support. And then we looked in between to a number of what we call the new kids on the block, LeanIX, RDoc, and Value Blue, Blue Dolphin van Value Blue, or Value Blue, which are all pure SaaS-based applications. Next slide. And so this is a slide set with some animations, Bart, so I will ask you to click here. So on the one hand, well, I didn't ask you to do it now, but fine. On the one hand, we looked at Archi, BizDesign, Abacus and Blue Dolphin, and you can click back. Which are literally model-driven tools, and this is a major element that you need to look at. They literally focus you on modeling, which basically means drawing of boxes and arrows, and these create these objects, and the relationships between these objects, you need to intrinsically manage them. The tool, of course, will help you with that, but you really need to think about what the different copies of these objects, how you want to live them, if you import them, and so on and so on. And all these tools are able to import data objects, but it's really foremost to pre-create objects for you then to use. And they all support that in more or less ways, which we'll talk about a bit later. So on the other hand, ClickBart, we have the tools like RDocs and LeanIX, and what you see there, it's more forms that you see, you can click. And what happens is that these are literally data-driven tools. They don't focus on the modeling part. They don't start from the modeling part, or they don't have the modeling as their core. They focus on the data and on the objects and the metadata of these objects. So the metadata is information about the different objects, which can be applications, which can be servers, which can be parts of the organizations, and then the relationships between them, and they generate these diagrams out of the data. And these tools are much more data import driven than the other tools, where the other tools have the capabilities. These two tools are literally very, very more looking at that. To that extent, for instance, of being data-driven, that LeanIX is more an application management tool than a pure architecture tool, I would argue. But it depends really where your focus is. Whereas RDoc really can generate architecture diagrams, but you cannot modify them. So also there, RDoc, it's more about exploring the relationships and creating visualizations rather than the modeling aspects. Why is Mega not in this picture, or Sparks? Well, I mean, we only had a couple of months to do the evaluation, so we were already happy to have been able to do 4, and we were not paid for that, so we had to make choices there. And yes, Mega would have been a contender, definitely. Look at this more as a grab, as an example, rather than an exhaustive thing. Okay. The next one, please. So if you look at the enterprise architecture tooling, there are different ways to collect the data, Clickbart. So the one is like we talked about the data imports. We talked about it in the former slide, but more in the context of the differences between the approaches of the tools. Now, again, this is, for many of these tools, still a work in progress. If you look at the older tools like BizDesign and Abacus, they have a certain way of importing data that is not always very helpful. Like BizDesign, it requires you to literally create a model type of thing. Now, on the other hand, it's not bad, but it uses its own modeling paradigm to create an import model. And let's face it, today there's much easier ways to do imports of data. And that's something that typically you see in the newer SaaS-based tools that they do much better, especially LeanIX is really strong in these imports of data. I expect the other toolings also going to be evolved more in that area. But most of it's still based on importing Excels, although other LeanIX, for instance, but some others start doing that also, can import from things like ServiceNow and these type of tools. Clickbart. And on the other hand, there is the enrichment of these objects. So the data import is mostly to create the base objects, but then you want to enrich these objects with either attributes that you already defined yourselves or attributes that you think are missing. And you can create on these objects questionnaires, which you then can send out to these different stakeholders. This is something that now most of the tools provide. The older tools do that because they have bolted on extensions for this. It's innately in the SaaS-based tools, where you can basically say, hey, you're responsible for this application. What is the cost, the total cost of ownership? What is the service level management? And also each of these objects have like a comment sections. So you can literally go into a dialogue there with your stakeholders. What I haven't shown is that then all the tools these days support a form of reporting that's built on top of the data that you assemble there, of which the same stakeholders can generate reports for them. Some are general reports, but in some cases you can even create separate workspaces per stakeholder where they can sort of click and match, create their own reporting. Next slide. So what is really important there for a tool is that you look at what's the meta model and the adaptability of the meta model that the tool uses. And some tools like LeanIX don't give you a choice. They have an intrinsic meta model, and that's the one that you need to use. Others are extensible, but some are really convoluted to extend, like BizDesign. Again, you need sort of to compile it. You need to adapt it in another tool and recompile it. Whereas other tools like Evolution are a bit more flexible in there. And why do you need this meta model, Clickbart? Because when you want to, first of all, to understand what are the relationships between the objects and the semantics of the objects, but also if you want to import external data, which you might have and you want to exploit, Clickbart, you need to assign them to the different meta models. And what you will see is that each of those imports have their own attributes which will not match the meta models. So you need to be able to extend it. So this is also a very important part of in the selection of your tool and a part of the success of an implementation, especially if you want to be able to both report on or import data, be through data imports or questionnaires of information that you as a company find important. So that's basically my part. So we can now go to the questions.
Yes, thanks a lot for all the interactivity in this session on tools and processes. It has been one of the most collaborative when I look at the chat. So a lot of remarks and discussions have been going on. I have taken note of a few of the questions being passed by and seen that Alain has also answered already a few. Maybe just to give the word back to Alain, there were two questions. One was on how do you address architectural compliance checks, and there was another one about integration with portfolio management. Could you maybe share your answers for the group?
yes. So first of all, on compliancy, indeed a good question, Yves, because it can be quite tricky and time consuming. But the essence is that, first of all, there's a lot of automation of how it is being deployed in production. So a lot of automation of log files. The architects, they steer the project a bit like in the construction business. They on a weekly basis, they go discussing with the project team how delivery is ongoing. They're following it up together with the lead engineer, the lead technical engineer, the lead functional engineer, the DevOps. So it's not a surprise after a couple of months what has been done. And next to that, since a project cannot go in production without a compliance report, and the feature managers are responsible for their backlog, by definition, this gets priority compared to having architects working on each time only new initiatives. So that's the first question, and then the second one was about portfolio management.
Yes.
How to fill in the gaps. So basically, portfolio management is done at the highest level, at MC level, as I explained in the change board. So we are on the table, and the technology office department also comes with its own backlog, like shown here in the other topic. For instance, for missing capabilities. For instance, a typical example is preference management is not something which is typically solved at transversal level, because every line of business having its own IDs. So then we ring the bell and we say, well, this is something missing. These are the advantages of doing this transversal, and then it gets prioritized by definition, as one example. Voilà.
Right. Thanks a lot, Alain. I would like to also call out to all the attendees. You can also feel free to wave your hand if you would like to ask the question rather orally, since we have still a few minutes for questions. In the meantime, I see a question being popped up by Leo towards Peter on bridging stakeholders. Leo, would you care to elaborate? Oh,
Yes, Peter focused a lot on structured data in the modeling tools, as we try to align with our stakeholders, and we talked a lot about collaboration with stakeholders and co-creation. That is a lot also about non-structured data. How to combine these two things, how to make them work together, how to bridge them.
So on the one hand, we have the whole section that Bart Dubois talked about on effectively how to create that unstructured data, sort of, in the sense of the whiteboarding and all these type of things. So if you capture it, most of these tools today, because my part is more about the tooling, also allow against objects in the database to attach information like Word documents or just files, drawings, and all these things that are effectively unstructured data. And of course, if you then model out, let's say, an epic or a feature, and you attach it to an object, or to a set of objects that are touched by the feature, then all the whiteboarding that you do around that, you could attach that to that feature object. Now, I am not saying that these tools are today the best possible document repository by itself, but it's something that you see happening. So I still think that things like SharePoints and that type of things, or Confluences, will be used to keep most of that documentation, but in some cases you might, for a specific whiteboarding exercise or from specific documentations, to also attach it to some of these objects objects in the tooling. Now, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay for now. It's a difficult problem, but I understand. It is no clear, no simple answer. That's what I understand.
No, and especially these tools, especially the younger ones who are more tackling that directly, are still in a lot of, let's say, they have a certain maturity, but they haven't necessarily fleshed out all these aspects. The older tools are catching up in that area. Some of them already allowed that in the past to say attach these links and so on, but they are, I would say, less user friendly. I would argue in some cases for doing that. So I would say the whole area of architecture tooling is relatively because there's not that many of them. I mean, there are a number of them, obviously, but it's not yet a completely solved problem, I would say.
Right. Thanks a lot. Any other burning questions remaining? Feel free to raise your hand. Then I will also announce, first of all, evidently thank the speakers. So thanks, Alain. It has been a pleasure of having you here in this session with us. Thanks for sharing your insights on that. Thanks as well, Laurent and Peter. So great work there. And I was impressed, Peter, with how you knew the animations. Then on the next breakfast session, the topic there is on time horizon, how to balance the short, medium, and long-term time horizon, which is a key arena for architects. That's planned for June 4th, so stay tuned. There will be an invitation which is going to be sent out. I hope that once again we are with so many people as today. It's a great networking opportunity. As you've seen as well, you can also contact and get to meet people purely just through the chat discussions which are going on in parallel with the talk. So there will be a follow-up email also with the links towards the presentation, but also a feedback form. That's also very useful for us because then we can continuously improve. So please do tell us what you're thinking about. Once again, you can follow up the list of webinars also at our webpage and on LinkedIn. So do stay tuned. Thanks again for your participation. I hope that it was worthwhile for you, and I look forward to welcoming you again on the 4th of June.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, goodbye, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.